the United States House of Representatives has voted for a full review of US-SA relations. We speak to retired Colonel Chris Wyatt, the former Director of African Studies at the U.S. Army War College. Welcome, Colonel.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. And boy, what an interesting topic to discuss.
Absolutely. Do you foresee major changes to U.S. policy towards South Africa if Trump returns to the White House, and even if he doesn't?
Well, to be fair, I think there should be major review of U.S.-South African relations. South Africa has not worked at all in the interest of U.S. foreign policy and our international interests, our national security. And also, it's made itself ineligible for the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So I think it's warranted to look at it. I'm not saying we should sanction South Africa or punish them, but I think it's something that needs to be discussed. However, I don't honestly think much is going to happen. When this first came up a short while ago, what was going on is that I believe a lot of people were electioneering. It's an election year in the States. They're looking for topics to be on top of because Israel or because of South Africa's position in the situation with Gaza. It put South Africa in the news, on the headlines, and I think people running for Congress were looking for votes and attention, particularly from certain constituencies, mostly Republican. However, this bill has now been attached to another bill in June, and it has gone through the House of Representatives, and 61 Democrats signed on to this. Now, they probably realize it's not going to be passed in the Senate as it sits right now with a Democratic majority of one. So they probably figured no harm, no foul. We can get away with this. We'll vote for it. We'll look good for our voters, and nothing will happen. So I don't think anything's going to happen in this Congress. However, in the next Congress, something could happen. But to be quite honest, if Trump does become the president again, there is so much that the country needs to address that South Africa, frankly, isn't going to rise to the level. And I think this will disappear because it's an election year issue. People are using foreign policy to make an election point, and I think it goes away. It doesn't matter what South Africa does, no matter how many times South Africa pokes the United States in the eye over its foreign policy, we still give South Africa billions of dollars, and we keep hundreds of thousands, millions of South Africans from dying from HIV, and we fund your telecommunications industry and so much more. So I honestly don't think that in the end, anything significant is going to change, whether it's a Democrat or Republican sitting in Washington, D.C. come January.
So you don't think that the African National Congress's foreign policy has irreparably damaged AGOA?
No, I don't. In fact, in my view, South Africa has been getting a free pass for several years. South Africa does not qualify for AGOA based on a number of things. In fact, I've looked at the legislation. I looked it up here. Let me point out 4 things where South Africa fails. The eligibility requirements for AGOA. Number one, you have to have a market-based economy that protects property rights for men and women. Well, the introduction of the expropriation without compensation legislation into Parliament in 2018 abrogated that responsibility. You are not protecting property rights if you're expropriating property without compensation. That arguably makes you ineligible, number one. Number two, the government must minimize government interference in the economy through measures such as price controls, subsidies, and government ownership of economic assets. Shall we run through the list? Airports Company South Africa, Transnet, South African Airways, the list goes on and on, Eskom. This is the government control of the economy, and the government has gone the opposite direction in South Africa. It has not diminished the government interference in state enterprises. It's actually increasing them. And so that's a problem. Technically, that makes you ineligible. Elimination of barriers to United States trade and investment. South Africa has attacked the U.S. over poultry exports to South Africa, claiming we're dumping products there, putting a 75% tariff on our poultry products because our poultry industry is far more competitive than South Africa's. I know that hurts, as a former farmer, I know that hurts the feelings of some people in the agriculture industry, but quite simply, it's a fact. Our poultry industry is exponentially larger and produce things much cheaper, even with shipping it to Africa. So the tariffs violate that. And then finally here, does not engage in activities to undermine the United States national security or foreign policy interests. South Africa's relationship with communist China, its relationship with Syria, its relationship with Iran, its relationship with Russia, all jeopardize that, and all are points that could be used to remove South Africa from AGOA. But I don't think South Africa be taken off AGOA. The two-way trade is about $25 billion per year. We're still South Africa's second largest trading partner, and South Africa benefits from that. Most of the benefit from that trade, we have a trade deficit with South Africa, and most of that benefit creates jobs and brings money to South Africa. So I don't think that we're going to get rid of it because AGOA is really just a foreign policy tool to win us good favor, give us access to places, and it's a soft power tool. I don't think South Africa would be removed from AGOA, but I think South Africa should be warned that their conduct is detrimental to our national security interest. And, you know what? The ANC is welcome to do what they want. But this is a gift. We give South Africa duty-free access to our market, and we get nothing in return. And all we ask for is good governance, and we're not getting that. So I think that it's warranted, but I seriously doubt that South Africa will be taken out of AGOA, even with Trump in office. He didn't take South Africa out of AGOA before, and all these things were happening before. The only major change has been the Gaza case and, of course, Russia's invasion. But all the rest of the stuff was already on the table the whole time that Trump was president, and we didn't take South Africa out of AGOA.
Now, Colonel, you were in South Africa recently. You witnessed the elections. What is your take on the outcome?
Well, it was fascinating. I tell you what, I passed up a job opportunity. I had a very lucrative job offer to go to Portugal and work for NATO as an analyst. And I actually turned it down because it was more important for me to observe South Africa's elections. Now, I wasn't an official observer. Let's get that out of the way in case someone likes. But I was there as a journalist, didn't interfere with voters, but I did interview people after they voted, and I observed polling stations from the outside. I'm also a judge of elections here locally in Pennsylvania. And what I can tell you as someone that actually runs polling stations is that I visited 12 polling stations in South Africa on election day. I got there just in time the night before my flight was almost canceled. I was like, just made it. I got there and I was in the Western Cape because I couldn't get up to Gauteng, which was my original plan. So it worked fine being in the Western Cape. I started Somerset West, and then I went to 5 polling stations in Khayelitsha. And from there, I went to Manenberg, then Rondebosch, Sea Point, Parklands, Woodbridge Primary, and Table View, What I can tell you is that it was a very uneven performance, at least in the Western Cape. It's clear to me that election officials were not properly trained in some polling locations by the IEC, or the people running the polling stations were not very good at their job. At Somerset West in the morning at 9:45, the first place that I rocked up at to observe, there were 850 people waiting to vote. So shortly after that, the IEC put out a message, I think, on Twitter saying that it's going to be a large turnout. We're expecting 70% today based on what's going on. That was misleading. What was going on is that polling stations weren't properly prepared. Now, I understand that at the polling station, if you're over the age of 60 or if you're pregnant or you have a child in a pram, you're supposed to be taken to the front of the queue. In most polling stations I went to, that wasn't the case. Only in Woodbridge Primary, Sea Point, and a couple stations in Khayelitsha, which, by the way, were run very well. Very well. I mean, people didn't have to wait long queues. People were well behaved. The electioneering that was going on was done with a safe distance away. So I have to compliment people on that. But in most stations, that wasn't happening. And the most egregious one I saw was Table View. I went there at about 9 o'clock in the evening, just before the polls supposed to close, and there were at least 1,400 people waiting to vote. I walked down the street where there's no lights. All the lights were out, not because of load shedding, but just because there's no lights there. I walked to the front of the building, and a couple came out, and I spoke to them, and I said, "How did it go? What was your experience?" And lady said, it was great, except I wish someone would have told us we could come to the front of the queue. We sat here waiting forever. But no one was working. But by contrast, at Woodbridge Primary, not too far from there, there were election poll workers who came outside when people were outside to ensure that people were getting their questions answered. They were in the right queue. If they were elderly, they're disabled, taken to the front of the queue, which was brilliant. That's what you're supposed to do. And so I would say that the performance of the IEC was uneven. As far as the conduct, everything I saw in the Western Cape was above board. Everybody from every political party was well-behaved. Azania, DA, UIM, EFF, everybody's well-behaved. And I have to congratulate South Africa on a fantastic election. Same time, and this may not go over well, and I'll get castigated for this, but I'm going to admonish the South Africans for not getting off their bum and going and voting. There was no excuse not to vote. The turnout was abysmally poor. And that actually helps smaller parties, and that's why we have a government of national unity. 4 million ANC voters didn't show up. I don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with people not voting. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, do you think the smaller parties in the new government of national unity could have a significant influence on foreign policy, particularly when it comes to Israel, Gaza, Russia, and the Ukraine?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I would argue if, in fact, the Democratic Alliance, which is wildly underrepresented in this government of national unity, they have a third of the power of the government of national unity, yet they only have 19% of the ministries. And the entire security cluster, the foreign policy cluster, policing, military intelligence, all are still under the control of the ANC. Arguably, the DA got only a handful of ministries that actually have any significance on South African society. If the DA had gotten, say, one or two other ministries of great importance, in my view, I think they might have been in a position where it shows that the ANC is humble, that they're working together. But I see no humility in the African National Congress. Just look at Gauteng. No humility whatsoever. Panyaza Lusufi's government there is a joke. Nationally, the ANC is still just as arrogant. They still think that they should rule until the rapture when everything ends. And I don't see any real changes coming that are apparent. Now, maybe as a consequence of working together in his cabinet, maybe Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC's NEC will soften their position, but I seriously doubt it. They've gotten this far with their lifelong commitment to the PLO, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to Russia, to Communist China. I don't see the ANC changing, and there's no one in a position of any of the parties that are in the government of national unity that can actually, in my view, influence them changing their foreign policy. So I don't see any changes coming.
Colonel, do you think South Africa will ever be in a position that it can turn around to America and say, we don't need you. We have China, we have Russia, we have BRICS?
Well, South Africa is welcome to do that now. I mean, but it will cost you several 100,000 jobs. And so if the ANC government or the current government of national unity wants to do that, they can do that. But honestly, I don't think that can happen. People talk about autarky and, self-reliance, and we can do this. But these people are living in a world of the 1960s and 70s when you could arguably do that in some ways. But the world is just too interconnected this day and age, whether people like it or not. I mean, whether I like it or not, we are dependent on global trade, even though it's a small percentage of our gross domestic product here in America. But other countries like South African countries in Africa, but European countries, especially Japan, China, are wholly dependent on their trade and the interaction of trade of goods and services. So I don't think South Africa can successfully go. I mean, take a look at your IT sector, take a look at your telecommunications sector, take a look at a lot of what's going on in South Africa. And if it wasn't for American companies, 600 of them are based there, many of them playing a key role in what's happening, you'd be in a bad shape. China can't replicate all that, and people think they can. Good luck with that. But, relations with China come with a cost. When I worked at the African Union, I cautioned people. I'd meet with people. We were having conversation about peacekeeping operations, say in the Central African Republic, or doing Ebola relief for the Mono River region. And I'd invite them to a coffee shop and no, let's talk over here at the AU building. Why? Do you want Beijing to hear everything we're talking about? And they laughed at me. I said, you do realize the building is full of listening devices and cameras. No, it's not. And then a few years after that, of course, it was exposed publicly. The Chinese who built the AU building loaded the building with listening devices and with cameras. And so the AU diplomats realized, we're not having private conversations. Now people are like, so what does that matter? Well, when you negotiate and you go into a conversation with another party, you have to have cards that you can keep to yourself. If you don't have cards you can keep to yourself and know what your negotiating position is, then you have a problem if your opponent knows exactly what position you're in. If they know you're in a position of weakness, you can't bluff them. If they know you have no cards to stand on. And so that's a real problem. But South Africa, if they want to try to go it alone without the U.S., they're welcome to do it, but it's just not going to work in today's modern world.
As an Africa expert, you have probably seen the influence of the West waning on the African continent. How do you see this war for Africa between the superpowers playing out?
Well, that's a really good question, Chris. Thank you for that one. First off, I'm not one that buys into this war. First off, Washington, London, Paris really don't care about Africa in the big scheme of things. I don't mean to hurt people's feelings. I think, Chris, I have a great affection for Africa. I've lived all over the continent, worked in 30 countries, lived in 8 of them. But the reality is that Africa does not rise to the geostrategic importance on almost any issue at any time for these countries. And as far as this war, we've heard this for years coming out of the DC establishment. And I know because I was in embassies all over Africa, working with the State Department, with the Defense Department, all of our actors, and constantly hearing about China and Africa, China and Africa, China. China's been in Africa since 1956. Okay, wake up, folks. The difference is that since the United States foolishly sponsored their entry into the World Trade Organization under Bill Clinton in 2000, and they consequently violated every World Trade Organization rule with no consequences, China has become a significant actor economically. Prior to that, the country was a joke. 1.5 billion people, just $4 billion economy. Now they're approaching $20 billion, or trillion. As I said billion, I meant trillion. $20 trillion economy. That's a significant actor. So China's always been there. The difference is the scale. And to me, this approach that people are taking is a Cold War wrong-headed approach. It's not a zero-sum game. You get this from leftists all the time who love socialism and communism. Well, the pie is only this big. There's 6 slices. No. If that were the case, then why do we create trillions of dollars of wealth from the e-commerce? How did that even happen? There's like no, magical little, minds of e-commerce. It's people's ideas and software and connections that link things, improve efficiencies, make e-commerce possible, make trade, improve the economies of scale. So it's just, for me, it's just this whole concept of a war for Africa, I think is misstated. There really isn't a war. As far as a war for Africa, we've lost. China has won. If you look at it that way, we've lost. China has influence all over the continent. They're gaining influence, and the U.S. is losing influence. Now, for the past 15 or 20 years, our influence was heavily impacted by our national security interest and working with partners in Africa for counterterrorism and training, equipping African militaries. But the Chinese are also in that field, and they're growing in that field. So I think that's wrong-headed to take the approach by our foreign policy establishment that it's a conflict. We can argue that China competes unfairly, which is true. They break laws, they do bribes, they have intellectual property theft, things like that. Absolutely. There are trade barriers. All that's true. But competing for Africa, we should be not competing with China for Africa. We should be competing in Africa to win Africa. One of the reasons why when I retired from active duty a couple of years ago, I started consultancy was because I wanted to get American companies to invest in Africa. A rising tide lifts all boats. But the problem is big American brands outside the ones like John Deere, Caterpillar, Microsoft, Google, outside those major manufacturers and Ford, things like that, you don't see American products. Can you tell me, Chris, have you ever seen cell or mobile phone service from Verizon in Africa or satellite service from DirecTV? No, these are American brands that aren't there. Some of our consumer brands are there. But my point is that American brands should go in Africa and they should compete for African business, because by 2050, Africa will have 2.3 billion to 2.5 billion people, even with all the people leaving the continent going elsewhere. And that represents a consumer market of over 900 million people with disposable income, by my own estimation. The United States total population is 330 million. We only have 250 million consumers. Imagine a marketplace where we can sell our goods and services to 900 million people. People not paying attention to that are not paying attention. So I think that this war conflict for Africa is overstated, and it's done for political purposes on both sides, in Beijing, in Moscow, in Washington, all for political purposes. And it's kind of like the BRICS thing, but we could get into that if you have time. I'm not sure if we have time today.
That is a topic for another interview. It will take up 20 minutes at least. May we go to your election, having survived our own? South Africans, many South Africans were riveted to the Trump-Biden debate and to Biden's recent public performances. What is your take on that
debate?
Colonel?
There was a debate. I'm sorry. I turned it on. I just got back from South Africa. I put it on the television and I frankly fell asleep within 5 minutes. Honestly, that's a statement of fact. I woke up at 2 a.m. Of course, that makes sense because it's 8 a.m. in South Africa for me. So I woke up at 2 a.m. and it was still on, replaying. And I watched it. And this wasn't a debate. This was a sad argument for elder care. And maybe for both of them, to be honest, neither one was impressive. And interest of full disclosure, I don't like Donald Trump, but I voted for him twice and I will vote for him again in November, given the options that I had in front of me. But I wasn't impressed by either one of them in this debate. It wasn't a debate. It was just sad. And it's really unfortunate that people in the political establishment will gaslight people just to achieve craven political power. And I think that's the problem we all have. And you can see that in the arrogance of the ANC. You can see that in the arrogance of Republicans and Democrats, the Tories, Labor, CDU, the SPD in Germany. It doesn't matter. Macron in France. The arrogance of political people. I ran for office recently, Chris, and lost badly. And in that loss, I did a thank you. I did a radio interview, and in it, and I said that politicians in office and those seeking office should not be doing so for craven political power, self-aggrandizement, or self-enrichment. But quite frankly, I'd say 80% of the people serving in office, whether it's in South Africa, it's in Berlin, it's in Washington, do this for craven political power, self-aggrandizement, self-enrichment. And that's heartbreaking because people are suffering, people are hurting, and it's our job as leaders to make life better and make the world work and make it safe for everybody. And that's what frustrates me.
Thank you. That was retired Colonel Chris Wyatt, the former Director of African Studies at the U.S. Army War College, speaking to BizNews. Thank you, Colonel, and I'm Chris Stein.